listening to Patriot Radio New Orleans on The Real Deal. This is the JFK show number 57. We've got Professor James Norwood tonight, who is at the helm of the OIC, which is the Oswald Innocence Campaign. We're going to talk about that, and we're going to also talk about propaganda from a bit of a JFK standpoint. James is going to be definitely piloting the ship tonight. He's at the helm of the show tonight, and he's at the helm of the OIC. Welcome to the show. Tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll get on to your presentation.
Well, Gary, thank you. It's a great pleasure and privilege to be talking with you again on your well-produced show. I have enjoyed our previous talks, and to update you a little bit and our audience on the Oswald Innocence Campaign, I began on March 11th of 2015 as the chair of Oswald Innocence Campaign. This is one of the most unique ideas on the internet for anyone interested in the JFK assassination, as it focuses on the subject of Oswald. The lead point is the photo, the Altgen 6 photo, with an in-depth analysis of that photograph and what specifically that may tell us about Oswald and the assassination. But the small community of OIC includes members who are interested in other facets of the JFK case as well. Distinguished members from multiple generations have joined us, including Mark Lane, Vincent Salandria, more recently Abraham Bolden. And what is really unique among the various forums is that this is a research forum. It's not one of just mindless chatter, but new contributions all the time are being shared among the members. So it's a great privilege to be have the title of chair of this organization, and my goal has primarily been to facilitate civilized conversation that occurs all the time within this group.
I'm part of the Oswald Innocence Campaign, and there's been a bit of some problems lately. And am I correct in you being brought in and put at the helm to get minds on track and to realize that it's not just a forum or a comment section?
Exactly. The past history has had some issues with the tumultuous conversations that are taking place, and so when I stepped in, I simply established some guidelines that would facilitate better, more congenial conversations. So that issue is now in the past, and we have had, such wonderful conversations with people even jumping in who are not members. Jim Mars has participated recently in conversations. Craig Roberts, who's one of our OIC members, is now participating. Vincent Salandria, the distinguished, one of the most distinguished of our members, has joined in the talks. So I think we are moving in a very positive direction with sharing ideas, having very friendly conversations, debating the issues, because there will be disagreements, but doing so in a way that will be mutually supportive of one another and really advance a conversation rather than just engage in the utterly mindless talk that often these internet forums degenerate into.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Well, since you've taken over, things seem to be much better. I certainly believe that you need to keep it focused about just what the whole Oswald Innocence Campaign is about. And I think you're doing a great job on that. Thumbs up to you.
Well, thanks, Gary. What is really unique about it is people who are very selflessly sharing their research, so that all the time we are getting something new. Ralph Sinkay has produced a couple of new videos recently. Larry Rivera is constantly involved in new research. He will send us these enormous files of documents. My area of interest is primarily in the historical dimension of the JFK case and the biography of Oswald. and I have submitted various articles and short essays, one of which recently has to do with propaganda. And that is why I'm looking forward in this program to talking with you about the nature of propaganda, why an understanding of that as a concept is so important, how we can apply it to the JFK case, as well as other controversial aspects of the events that are part of our world today. So propaganda is an essential concept, and I know you've done some thinking about this and a little research. Why don't we begin by trying to formulate or discuss or work out a definition of what actually is propaganda?
All right, well, let's get underway. I know you've got a great presentation on this propaganda, and I know we're all about to take a collegiate-level trip down the propaganda road, so let's go.
Well, why don't we begin by a little working definition of propaganda. It comes from the Latin propagare, which means to spread, and quite simply the concept is to not only share, but to spread information in a way that seeks to convince or to change minds. I think that there's a sort of stereotype image that people have of propaganda, that it is something completely sinister in nature. And it may be important to lighten up a little bit on the idea of propaganda. All propaganda is not like Hitler's Mein Kampf, that is an absolutely abhorrent writing that seeks to change minds in a very destructive way. We might look at, for example, the 30-second television commercial and see an example of propaganda at work. We might go back all the way to the time of the writing of the New Testament of the Bible and see that as a work of propaganda. The word Gospels, denoting the books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the word gospel itself means to share the good news. And so the idea of the New Testament was to share the good news about the life of Jesus. And one might argue that that was one of our early works of propaganda. Propaganda is certainly associated very much with religious kinds of writing, and arguably modern propaganda begins in the age of the Reformation, when religious tracts, specifically the Lutheran writings, including his initial theses posted on the doors of the Wittenberg Cathedral, allegedly, were presented in the written medium, and that then spread. It spread to such a degree that eventually the Protestant sect broke away from the Church of Rome. So that first great wave of propaganda in the modern age was in the Protestant Reformation, and the next step came to be political propaganda. That was used certainly in the French Revolution and even in the American Revolution. One might look at a work like Thomas Paine's Common Sense. It was written as a sermon, and it included biblical references. But this was the great text, written and circulated as a pamphlet, that inspired the Revolutionary War in America. Common Sense had the largest circulation of any work heretofore published in the American colonies, and for those who could not purchase a copy or read it, it was read aloud in taverns. George Washington, early in the war, read aloud from this pamphlet to his ragtag American army assembled in Boston. And then after the war, looking back, Washington observed that this book had worked a powerful change in the minds of many of his men. That concept of working a change in the minds of men gets right at the heart of propaganda. So my initial take on propaganda is that this is a word in which if we take the charge out of it, it is something that is much more prevalent than we would ordinarily think. And that when we study the JFK case, what comes into mind more than anything else is the Warren Report as a work of propaganda. This is hardly ever mentioned. It's considered to be such a bastion of integrity on the part of these unimpeachable men, the blue ribbon panel who produced this document. But in point of fact, the Warren Report is propaganda. If we define it as the goal of spreading information and above all including one point of view, propaganda is typically not inclusive of different positions, but it focuses on one point that it seeks to propagate. In the religious era of the Reformation, the religious propaganda was not a kind of inclusive and diverse and tolerant position. Rather, it was promoting aggressively a single point of view. So the Warren Report is in itself a great work of propaganda. And if we can look at that as such, then we can see that it's not necessarily to be equated with historical truth. So that's a little overview of propaganda as a concept or an idea, and simply a commonplace occurrence in the world in which we live today.
Yeah, it just seems to be, well, it appears to me that it's not all bad. It could be good, it could be bad, but like you're saying, it's not all about Hitler and evil things.
Exactly. And concerning other controversial events in our world today, it's important to keep in mind that almost anything we're going to read about them has a propaganda value, and we have to then look carefully at the evidence and make up our own minds, rather than simply to trust someone by way of blind faith. You know, I can remember when our national presses in America had a kind of distinctive stamp about them, where if you would, for example, read Newsweek and read Time and read U.S. News and World Report, you would really get different points of view. But it seems to me in 2015, the media, the press, the printed media, as well as especially the broadcast media, it's all the same. It's one point of view. We don't have those opposing kinds of positions anymore. Well, why don't we have a look at the birth of modern propaganda in America? Because I think we can isolate to a very specific moment of time and see what happened where we have the emergence of propaganda as we know it today. And that occurs specifically around the years of World War I, beginning specifically with America's entrance into the war, taking its place on the grand stage to participate in World War I. To understand that, we need to know the presidency of Woodrow Wilson, because in his second term of office, he had run on the platform of keeping us out of the war. That was his big campaign slogan. He kept us out of war. And so when Wilson decided that America would enter into the fray in World War I, he had to convince the American public of the importance of that particular choice. In that regard, he enlisted a man by the name of George Creel to head up a new committee, a group by the name of the CPI, the Committee on Public Information, the purpose of which was to rally popular support for the war and spread what Wilson called the gospel of Americanism. I mean, talk about propaganda. This was the great effort on the part of Woodrow Wilson to sell the war to the American people.
After campaigning on not getting us in the war.
Exactly. And the fact that he was voted into office with an overwhelming amount of support, it in effect meant that he would have to go back on his word that we were not going to participate. So his idea and goal was to enlist a strong propaganda effort on the part of this Committee of Public Information, and with a personnel and a significant budget with no less than 150,000 people, George Creel blanketed the nation with publications supporting the World War I effort. They issued a daily newspaper. There was an international relations group in which foreign offices were set up in the major capitals in foreign countries to try to promote, in at least Creel's words, every conceivable means to reach the foreign mind with America's message. Now, America's message was specifically, for Wilson, the goal of spreading democracy. So, fighting the war was for Wilson the war to end all wars, and he needed the American people on his side in order to get this through Congress and then have the national support for the war. Quite honestly, the American people did not want to participate in World War I. And there was an isolationist climate then that was supported before his death in 1910 by such luminaries as Mark Twain, who saw the writing on the wall during the regime of Teddy Roosevelt and warned against America transforming itself into the Roman Empire. So the climate was such that Wilson really needed this propaganda effort. And one of the choices that was made by George Creel was to develop a group that he called the 4-Minute Men. Now, the 4-Minute Men were thousands upon thousands of amateur orators. These were effective speakers who were enlisted for public appearances on street corners, but especially in movie theaters, where they would talk to audiences for a 4-minute period. Of course, this was the age of pre-electronic media, and so the goal was direct contact with large groups of people. These 4-Minute Men prepared extremely gripping, very moving speeches that were delivered in the movie theaters and the public halls to people that would rally support for the war. I have found estimates ranging as high as 400 million spectators who listened to these talks.
Wow, James, nothing has changed since then.
Well,
they still get the numbers.
Yeah, absolutely. So that with that number, people heard time and again the same speeches. They were simply drummed into them to the degree that they were simply accepted as the truth. Some of the themes included topics such as maintaining morals and morale, food conversation, the sale of Liberty loans. In Creel's own words, his goal was for the speeches to have the effect of war shrapnel on audiences.
Wow.
So it was intended to get under their skin, and the intended result was nothing less than the acceptance of a new war culture in America. Now, I thought our audience might enjoy hearing some excerpts from these 4-minute speeches. They would often take on a very solemn quality, where one would begin, for example, "Ladies and gentlemen, I have just received the information that there is a German spy among us, a German spy watching us." And you can just imagine the hush coming over the crowd as people are kind of squirming in their seats, wondering who they might be sitting next to here. And then they would take on also a very almost religious quality, where they would drum in the significance and the importance of giving one's life for this great cause. And so these guys would get up and read little poems, such as the following. And I have only memories of my brave boy so dear. I'd rather have it so, my boy, and you know bravely died, than have a living coward sit supinely by my side. To save the world from sin, my boy, God gave his only son. He's asking for my boy today, and may his will be done. And then, of course, there would be a great tribute to the new iconic image that had evolved in this time, and that was the figure of Uncle Sam. Your Uncle Sam, the dear old man who's been so good to you, is needing help and watching now to see what you will do. Your uncle's in the Great World War, and since he's entered in, it's up to every one of us to see that we shall win. Now, we can laugh at these ridiculous 4-minute speeches today, but in their time, if you can just imagine the audiences, they would be almost like they were sitting in a church service, hearing these things.
Working to a frenzy almost.
Absolutely. It would be stirring emotions, or it would be a kind of guilt-induced trip,
fear,
or working on people's emotions in a way to get them to support the war cause.
But worst of all, it worked.
It absolutely worked, and it was done on such a grand scale that this George Creel was working on different fronts. He got into the universities as well, where the curriculum began to change, where the values of Western civilization became inculcated for the students. German language courses were dropped from the curriculum at some universities. And new words would actually creep into the American dialect and the everyday speech, where the word liberty was especially used with great excess. The word hamburger came to be replaced by liberty sandwich. Liberty cabbage was sauerkraut because they didn't want to use German words. German measles became liberty measles in this time. People with German-sounding names changed them because of the climate at the time. So this was something that was being drilled into people's hearts and minds, and it was also legally enforced by way of what was called the Espionage Act. This was passed just as we were entering the war in 1917, and it basically meant that there could be no opposition to the war. You could not voice complaints or opposition without running risk of being in violation with this law. It was, according to historian Scott Berg, the greatest possible expression of patriotism and the greatest suppression of free speech heretofore in American history. So that was basically the Patriot Act of 1917, except in a much more intensive and severe fashion. Taken together, these efforts of the CPI, the 4-Minute Men, the transformation of the universities, everyday language on the streets reflecting the new war ethos, and the Espionage Act, that can change the very notion of a free society. And that's exactly what happened at this turning point of our involvement in World War I.
The thing that surprises me the most is you would think in the electronic age they would be reaching 400 million people, but they were reaching them back then with no electronics.
Absolutely, Gary, and I think a good expression to describe what you're talking about is this long and slow and steady process of the numbing of the American mind. It wasn't something that just happened instantly, but it's a slow and steady progress that really has its birth in this period in World War One. After World War One, we went back a little into an isolationist climate, but once we were in World War II, it was the same kind of propaganda that was being worked once again during those war years. Ronald Reagan was especially prominent in the producing of propaganda films in World War II. He made something like 225 films working out of the first motion picture unit in Los Angeles during the war. Reagan himself was rejected for active military duty due to his poor eyesight, but he was conscripted and then placed in charge of this film program in LA, where he acted in and narrated many of these war films. He had some great lines in some of those films, like when he said, "It's shooting like this that will knock them on their axis." That's AXIS, axis, of course. So Reagan was a narrator, a film actor of propaganda that deeply influenced, arguably, his view of the world that he then modeled eventually when he got into politics as governor of California and then a two-term American president. So what you're describing about the climate today is something that has been a slow and steady multi-generational process that we can relate to and identify with right now.
Don't you think it's an incredible task to take on to convince millions of people that war and killing is the right thing to do?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that only someone with the kind of visionary mindset of Woodrow Wilson could have even imagined that this was possible. Because Wilson himself was a great idealist. And he had these grand ideas, and he was enormously popular with the public. He was treated almost like a god when he came to Europe. They thought he was going to be the great savior because of his grand idealism. You know, his 14-point plan was his blueprint to change the world. And of course, it was, tragically a failure because he never realized those goals. But he was a controversial figure. There's, I think, a great division about Woodrow Wilson and people who are great and loyal supporters of his, and those who, think that he was virtually the devil incarnate. But he had this great idealism, and so he thought that minds could be changed on that grandiose scale. And that, at least, is precisely what he did with selling people on the war.
You're listening to The Real Deal. This is the JFK Show number 57. We have Dr. James Norwood tonight, and we'll be right back. All right, welcome back to the JFK Show. We've got Dr. James Norwood on again tonight, and we're to the point of propaganda in our lifetimes. We've just gone through the World War I, and we're going to begin to cut through World War II, and then the times that we may be able to remember.
Yes, Gary, out of World War I, it should be noted that an individual who is enormously influential receives his training during those years of American propaganda. And the name of this chap is J. Edgar Hoover, because his formative years coincide with those early developments in American propaganda. His mind was shaped by those uses of propaganda that he experienced during the Wilson years, and that he then would use himself through his decades-long career in the FBI. Now, along with the propaganda, Hoover cultivated the habit of maintaining these enormous confidential files, which consisted primarily of sex dossiers that he used to blackmail members of Congress and other influential elected officials. He made a science of gathering information on Americans for the purpose of discrediting them, even ruining their lives. He had a special axe to grind against civil rights leaders. Marcus Garvey, Paul Robeson, Martin Luther King came under the watchful eye of Hoover, who developed these files, and he had constant leverage over the most powerful people in the executive branch by way of his files on American presidents. Now, the number 3 man at the FBI at the time of the JFK assassination was William Sullivan. When Sullivan was brought before the HSCA in the 1970s, there was a preliminary interview in which Sullivan made one of the most important revelations possible about Hoover. He said the following: if Hoover decided there were documents that he didn't want to come to the light of the public, then those documents would be destroyed, and the truth would never be known. Now, that is a shorthand definition of the state-sponsored uses of propaganda. Hoover was controlling the information. He was sifting out what he wanted to use, and if there was something that would not support his specific goals, then that information would be destroyed. What we're talking about here is almost the vision that had been written about by George Orwell in his novel 1984. It is propaganda on a grand scale, and Hoover was one of the key officials, of course, who helped to promote and support the eventual findings and conclusions of the Warren Commission. We can even see Hoover at work 2 days after the JFK assassination, when a front-page article in the New York Times was entitled, "Evidence Against Oswald Described as Conclusive." There's your lead story, the story of Oswald as presidential assassin that was flooding the media, with Hoover as the key official providing the incriminating evidence. Concurrently, he was suppressing alternative scenarios, which is why it's difficult for us as researchers today to try to get at the documentary evidence that is the truth, because it's like assembling a jigsaw puzzle in which there are both missing pieces and incorrect pieces on the table, thanks to J. Edgar Hoover. So Hoover's one of the key figures in understanding how the Warren Report came about, specifically the information that was used by propaganda to promote the single point of view of the lone gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald. Certainly, the propaganda developments in America were reinforced by the new medium of television. The radio was important, especially during the World War II years, but then beginning in the 50s and then into the 60s, of course, we had the phenomenon of the modern talking head. And if you want any example of the revered and respected sort of avuncular and ever-to-be-trusted newscaster, it would have been Walter Cronkite. And so, as influential as any single broadcaster, Cronkite presented the original official story of the JFK assassination, and he then reinforced it over the decades with these CBS specials that drilled into Americans' minds and hearts the lone assassin and the single bullet theory of the Warren Report. Now, researcher Larry Rivera and I conducted a very interesting interview in the year 2014 with an eyewitness from Dealey Plaza who mentioned Walter Cronkite and the influence that he had on her in understanding the JFK assassination. This was Tony Glover, who was 11 years old at the time. She was standing up on the pedestal, the white pedestal at the corner of Houston and Elm. She had a bird's eye view of the president coming up Houston and then turning left on Elm, witnessing the assassination from this perch that she had up on the pedestal. It was exactly like the pedestal of Zapruder, except it was the one that was built and positioned in the Dealey Plaza architecture at the corner of Houston and Elm. Today, Tony Glover is a tenured professor of English at the University of Scranton in Pennsylvania. She's a delight to talk with, an excellent talker, and has a razor-sharp memory of the events that she had witnessed and experienced in Dealey Plaza. Now, what Tony Glover told us was that, and I have actually never heard this or read about this before from eyewitnesses in Dealey Plaza, was that the sound of the motorcycles was so deafening on the street level that it was absolutely impossible for the bystanders to hear the actual gunshots, let alone to be able to identify the number of gunshots that were fired. She went on and on saying how the noise was just deafening. And then when she told us that, she then broke from the discussion of the loud noise in Dealey Plaza and told us the following, and I quote, "Look, I'm going on history. When we drove home, Walter Cronkite said he was gunned down in Dealey Plaza. Once you hear that, it's glued." And then she added that Cronkite had said that 3 shots were fired. So how would a broadcaster sitting in New York know that 3 shots were fired when this little girl on the street, and obviously others, could not discern the number of shots? This was clearly propaganda. Now, I'm not suggesting that Walter Cronkite was a conspirator, but he was sort of like the 4-minute man of his new generation, reporting what he's told to report and feeling that it's his patriotic duty to do so. He was fed these lines. 3 shots rang out in Dallas. And of course, whenever we read about the JFK assassination, invariably the commentary is going to begin, 3 shots rang out. Why is that number 3 important? It's important because if there were more than 3 shots, it would have meant that there was more than one shooter, since Oswald allegedly could not have gotten off more than 3 rounds through the use of the Mannlicher Carcano. That was the essential point that had to be delivered to the American public. It was delivered by way of propaganda, and it has then been reinforced by historians ever since, who write about that in their accounts of the assassination. So how is it conceivable that anyone could even speculate on the number 3 so soon? We're talking about this being reported instantly. And then, of course, the number 3 becomes important in the autopsy, because their conclusion is going to be, interestingly, very coincidental, that the president was killed by one of 3 shots. He was struck. They actually said that he was hit by 3 bullets, and then later had to change that once it was learned that James Tague was wounded by another bullet. Otherwise, there would have been 4. So the propaganda here has to do with your magic number of 3. 3 shots rang out, maximum of 3 gunshots fired. In a close study of the evidence, of course, there's enough information that we have to conclude that there were more than 3 shots fired at that limousine. Some have speculated as much as 6 to 8 shots, including even a CIA official, Homer McMahon, who concluded that over the assassination weekend. So there you have the workings of propaganda. And once it is put forth to the public, it then becomes ingrained, or what Tony Glover has said, that it's glued to your mind. That's how propaganda very effectively works. I think another topic related to propaganda is how individual words filter into the language by way of supporting the particular political climate of the age, and they begin to convey things that the power elite wants to be inculcated into the public. We know for a fact that this happened in Nazi Germany with words that were actually coined and developed or refashioned in a way to make plausible to the public certain things that were going on that had to be presented by way of euphemisms. The word fanaticism was actually turned around 180 degrees to be used as something that was admirable. If you're a government that is employing fanatic tactics, that is something that one admires, because it is such an extreme and radical point of view that is designed to help the public. Lebensraum, living space or living room, was the notion coined for German expansionism. They needed to move east to get more land for spreading out the great culture of the Third Reich. Evacuation was a term that was used for deportation, and it took the charge out of that term. So I think it's very important when we want to observe the workings of propaganda and sort out the truth from the fiction to understand some of these words that are being used. An entire lexicon has been developed, for example, to delineate serious researchers of the JFK assassination. They are called over and over by Vincent Bugliosi in his book Reclaiming History, conspiracy buffs. And so anyone who challenges the conclusions of the Warren Commission is a conspiracy theorist or a conspiracy buff. And Warren Commission apologist John McAdams has popularized the term factoid to use for any fact that he's taking as trivia when the fact can refute the evidence that is presented by the Warren Commission. Even the term grassy knoll has come into modern parlance to be used as a pejorative, denoting anyone who's thinking about some wild point of view or another conspiracy theory. These words are right out of the world of George Orwell, who had himself coined such memorable concepts and terms as doublethink and big brother, old think, face crime, thought crime, and so on in his novel 1984. I think Orwell was an extremely astute student of his world, of the totalitarianism of the World War II era, and then the early Cold War period. And 1984 is a book that everyone should have on their shelves and review from time to time to get us in touch with the future that Orwell himself had envisioned in this extraordinary novel. So, an understanding of propaganda, I think, is an absolutely vital topic to come to terms with complex, controversial, contradictory events of our time. And one reality that is rather tragic about the phenomenon of propaganda is that those who actually create the propaganda come to believe it themselves. as something that is real. So it may be that there is not necessarily a completely sinister attempt on the part of those propagating the propaganda. They are merely victims themselves of believing their own lies. We know that was certainly the case for the Nazis, who were so disillusioned that to the very end, the Nazis, including Hitler and Goebbels in their Berlin bunker, felt that they were dying for a noble cause. And Goebbels even believed that there should be some memorialization of their moment going up in flames by way of a great documentary film that would demonstrate their great contributions. And I think people even like Gerald Ford, who was serving on the Warren Commission, was sincere from the point of view that he believed what he was doing was right. Even though he wasn't close to the truth at all, and he was disseminating inaccurate information, he personally believed it himself. I know many will disagree with me on that point, but I think the guy was genuine. The nature of propaganda is such that a kind of cognitive dissonance is at work, and people come to believe what they should know is not the truth. It's a very interesting experience of Western journalists when they first visited the Soviet Union in the early years of the Stalin regime, and they were told, you can't write that because it is true. Now, in journalism, of course, the writer typically will not write something if it's false. But when there is widespread propaganda, it's exactly the opposite. You can't write it because that is true. And I think in many ways that's the case with the truth seekers of the JFK assassination. If we do write something that is true, we might be able to write it, but people aren't going to believe it because of the effect that propaganda has had in disseminating that original story that was then set in stone by the Warren Commission. Again, propaganda is this one idea, and the monomyth of the Warren Report presented that in such an official format that is the chief obstacle to overcome for widely spreading the truth and rewriting the history books about the JFK assassination.
It's taken a half a century, and we're still not there yet.
We're still not there yet, and it may not happen in our lifetimes, but I think that our friend and colleague Larry Rivera made a very important point recently when he said that it's important for us to leave an important trail of the evidence for future generations and future historians. If they can find something that is persuasive, it is great works like books like those of James Douglas and Jim Fetzer's works, his great trilogy, and others. The work of Douglas Horne, which has basically uncovered the medical evidence out of the study of the ARRB. So many of these great books are right out there telling the truth, and eventually the mainstream media and historians will have to accept them because they are simply overpowering in their persuasiveness. I think also, Gary, we can learn a lot about the uses of persuasive discourse from these 4-minute men back in the teens, because these orators demonstrated how effective a very short and well-crafted speech can be. They got up in front of these crowds, delivered their message, and then people then took that home with them. They took it out onto the streets as a topic of discussion. And it became ingrained in such a way that it then turned into a belief system. And I think if we can get out short information, I know that Ralph Sinkay has produced 2 very effective 3-minute videos on the JFK assassination. He's especially good with photos and his photo collages. And he's also extremely gifted with musical composition. So he's presenting a very moving and effective mini presentation in the media that is on the internet and that can be accessed on YouTube. Similarly, another OIC member, Peter Janney, has simply videotaped a 5-minute talk that he gave about his book, Mary's Mosaic, and that is available online. It's a good 5-minute wrap-up, very short, very effective, that conveys his story based on his research. I would point out, too, a difference between those examples and the 4-Minute Men. Instead of presenting propaganda, Ralph and Peter are actually telling the truth by way of their wonderful presentations in that short format.
So you're telling me that we should have done this in 4 minutes?
Well, I think it would have been a tough job, but I think if people listen to the first 4 minutes, they're going to want to hear more. At least that's my expectation and hope.
All right, well, Doctor, I have a few questions for you. You were talking about 1984. Could you give us some examples of some of the words like doublespeak or newspeak?
Well, yes. I think the first one that is so prominent that almost everyone will identify with in some capacity is Big Brother. A Big Brother is watching you. And because of the technology that was used in the novel, everyone's individual waking moments of life were being recorded on camera. So in today's world, at any given time, we might find ourselves being played back or reviewed by way of some hidden camera. I actually felt a little sorry for this ESPN reporter who had gotten a little irritated at an employee with a towing company, and she'd given her a little bit of attitude, but that conversation was recorded, and then the ESPN reporter was suspended because that was captured on camera. That was an example of Big Brother.
Big Brother, yeah.
Watching you. The doublethink concept has to do with contradictory kinds of issues that simply confuse people so that it's impossible to know the truth. And we're all familiar with disinformation in a way that leads us off the track. It leads us astray from understanding the main point simply by way of confusion that is being worked. And I think probably the one that is most scary is what he calls thought crime, because there the people have been conditioned to the degree that they can't even think thoughts that may not be supportive or in accordance with the state party line. And there's one character in the novel who's having these dreams, and when he shares his dreams, he gets into trouble because even in his subconscious mind, he's thinking about things that he shouldn't be thinking about, and he is then heavily disciplined for a thought crime. Now, Orwell is using that in a biting kind of satirical way, but at heart, there's a very serious message about how propaganda can condition people, and through especially the uses of fear tactics, that propaganda can be used to make people cower and then accept in an abject way the standard point of view, whatever that may be. So those terms of Orwell are fascinating. There's an entire lexicon of those terms that he's developed in the novel that have an eerie kind of resemblance to our world today.
I did see a video where there were devices. They could detect if you were planning to bring in a device into an arena or something like that. I did have a show about that one time. But what about newspeak?
Well, the newspeak is the idea of a single state-sponsored press or media. And that, of course, has an eerie resemblance to our world today, because it's basically hard to get a dissenting point of view, an opposition press. The newspeak, it's constantly being broadcast. In an interesting way, Orwell has in his novel these large screens, and the screens are constantly presenting the news. They're giving updates on situations that have a lot to do with foreign wars that are being fought. And it's all around you. You're surrounded by the screen.
Fox News.
Absolutely.
Do you know how many people I know that have that Fox News screen on 24/7? They just watch it all the time. Sometimes it may be on CNN, but it's on all the time. And there it is in George Orwell's book right there.
And you go into public establishments, in a waiting room in a medical office. You might have,
there it is,
Fox News or CNN playing. So we just can't find any relief from it at all. That's the newspeak concept.
Yeah, even if the volume's down, they still have the words going across, the teletype, going across the bottom of the screen.
Yeah.
Always talking about gee ha ha or something like that. It always has to be the worst thing possible. Something had to blow up, someone's head had to be chopped off, or someone had to be burned alive. But the fact is that most of that is manufactured news.
So, I had kind of an Orwellian experience just walking into and experiencing the Sixth Floor Museum in Dallas. Because you walk in there and you just get one point of view, especially. And I think you could coin or use the Orwellian words to describe how they've set that thing up. Because the people who walk out of there are just completely confused.
You're absolutely right about that. It's called the Disinformation Museum. Dr. James Norwood, we appreciate you being on the show so much again. We've run out of time, but you've been a great guest as usual, and we've got to have you on much more often.
Thank you, Gary.
All right. Thank you again. We'll talk to you soon.
Night.